I woke up to the soft glow of morning light filtering through my curtains, stretching lazily as I reached for my phone, my heart already anticipating the familiar buzz of notifications, the small but meaningful messages that would remind me I was thought of. That today wasn't just another day, that someone out there actually cared enough to acknowledge it. I blinked against the brightness of the screen, my fingers scrolling instinctively through my notifications, searching for the names I had been conditioned to expect, the ones that, year after year, had at least managed to remember, if nothing else, to send a quick, "Happy birthday" text. But as I stared at the screen, my stomach twisted slightly, an uncomfortable weight settling in my chest as I realized there was nothing. No missed calls, no texts, no messages from my parents, no simple acknowledgement that today meant anything at all. I took a deep breath, shaking off the initial sting, brushing away the disappointment like it was nothing more than an overreaction, a moment of unnecessary sensitivity, a fleeting emotion that I refused to let take root. They're probably just busy, I told myself, forcing my mind to make excuses before the doubt could sink in, before the sadness could wrap itself around my ribs and squeeze. Dad always gets caught up with work, and Mom has been so focused on Tyler's job interviews. Maybe they just haven't had time to check their phones yet. It wasn't like I was a child anymore, wasn't like I needed a cake or a grand celebration, wasn't like I expected presents wrapped in colorful paper or balloons tied to my chair at the breakfast table. I just wanted something. A simple message, a quick phone call, a brief moment where they paused long enough to say, "Hey, Rachel, we remember you exist." The hours stretched on, and with every glance at my phone, every mindless refresh of my notifications, every passing minute that remained empty, my excuses became harder to believe, my patience wearing thinner, my optimism fading into something colder, something sharper, something that left a bitter taste in my mouth. I kept myself busy, distracting myself with meaningless tasks, cleaning my already spotless kitchen, reorganizing my bookshelves, answering emails that didn't need immediate attention. Anything to keep my mind from circling back to the glaring silence that loomed over me like a storm cloud waiting to break. By midday, I found myself checking my parents' social media, scrolling through their recent
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
posts, looking for any indication that they had simply forgotten to text me but had somehow managed to find the time to post about their day. And sure enough, there they were, pictures of my mother out to brunch with her friends, my father commenting on an article about stocks, both of them going about their lives without a single pause, without a single reminder that today, to me, was supposed to mean something. I stared at my screen, the weight in my chest pressing heavier now, an ache I hated to acknowledge creeping into my bones, my fingers tightening around my phone as if I could somehow will the messages to appear, as if I could force them to remember through sheer frustration alone. But nothing came, nothing changed. Nothing broke the silence except my own bitter realization that I was waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. By the time the evening rolled around, I had gone from making excuses to outright resenting them, my mind no longer searching for justifications, but instead picking apart every instance in which they had treated me like an afterthought. Every moment where I had been pushed aside in favor of Tyler, every time I had swallowed my own disappointment just to keep the peace. My phone sat face up on the coffee table, the screen dark, still void of any messages, the final nail in the coffin of whatever shred of hope I had been holding onto since the morning. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a simple case of forgetfulness that could be excused away with a rushed apology and a "we were so busy" excuse. They hadn't forgotten because they were preoccupied. They had forgotten because, to them, it simply wasn't important enough to remember. I swallowed against the lump forming in my throat, exhaling slowly as I leaned back against my couch, staring up at the ceiling, forcing myself to let go of the expectation that had been suffocating me all day. Maybe they were right. Maybe birthdays really didn't matter once you were an adult. Maybe waiting around for validation, for acknowledgement, for love in the form of a text message was nothing more than foolish sentimentality. Maybe I was the one being ridiculous, the one clinging to something that had never truly existed in the first place. But deep down, Beneath all the forced rationalization, beneath all the logical arguments I tried to make with myself, there was a small, sharp, undeniable truth that settled in my gut like a weight I would never be able to shake. It wasn't that they forgot. It was that they simply didn't care. Have your parents ever made you feel like you were invisible? Let me know, because I finally had enough. 2 weeks passed in a blur of work, routine, and the quiet, lingering resentment that settled deep in my bones, a dull ache that refused to fade no matter how many times I told myself that it didn't matter, that I shouldn't care, that their silence on my birthday wasn't worth the weight I was giving it. I had promised myself that I wouldn't dwell on it, that I wouldn't waste any more energy hoping for an apology that was never going to come, that I wouldn't let myself sink into the same tired cycle of disappointment that I had been trapped in for most of my life. But then, as if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, an invitation arrived in my inbox, a brightly colored email subject line that made my stomach twist the moment I read it. Join us to celebrate Tyler's birthday in style. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over again, my pulse steady, but my jaw tightening, my fingers gripping my phone with enough force to make my knuckles ache. The message was from my mother, cheerful and enthusiastic, filled with details about the extravagant party they were throwing for my younger brother, a catered event at one of the nicest restaurants in town, a night filled with drinks, music, and a guest list that seemed to include everyone but me. They hadn't even bothered to call or text me on my own birthday, hadn't even remembered I existed, and yet, here they were, throwing a massive celebration for Tyler, sparing no expense, making sure that his day was perfect, special, unforgettable. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so undeniable, that I almost laughed, but the sound never quite made it past my throat, swallowed down by something heavier, something darker, something that made my hands tremble as I read through the message again. I should have deleted it. I should have ignored it. I should have pretended it didn't affect me the way it did. But instead, I found myself typing out a simple response, my fingers moving before I could stop them. I'll be there. I don't know why I agreed to go, why I let myself step back into a space where I knew I wasn't truly wanted, why I was willing to sit through another night of pretending that everything was fine when, deep down, I knew it never would be. Maybe I wanted to see it for myself, to confirm what I had always suspected, to witness the evidence of their favoritism in real time rather than just feeling it like a slow-burning ache beneath my skin. Or maybe I just wanted a reason to finally let go of the last shred of hope that I had been clinging to for far too long. When I arrived at the restaurant that night, the first thing I noticed was the sheer scale of it all, the shimmering decorations, the expensive floral arrangements, the beautifully set tables covered in candles and crystal glasses, the sheer effort that had been put into making this night perfect. Guests were already mingling, drinks in hand, laughter filling the air, the kind of warmth and energy that had been so obviously absent on the day of my birthday. My mother spotted me almost immediately, her face lighting up as she made her way toward me, her arms outstretched like she had been waiting all night just to see me, like she hadn't ignored my existence 2 weeks earlier without a second thought. "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you could make it," she exclaimed, pulling me into a quick hug before stepping back to scan my face, her smile never faltering. "We've just been so busy lately. You wouldn't believe how much planning went into all of this. I've barely had time to breathe." I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment, anger, maybe, or hurt, or some desperate need to make her see the irony in what she was saying. To make her understand how absurd it was that she could stand there and talk about how busy she had been while throwing this elaborate party, while putting all of this energy into celebrating Tyler, while not even bothering to send me a 2-second text on my birthday. But all I felt was nothing. It was never about being busy. It was never about forgetting. It was about the fact that, to them, I simply wasn't important enough to make time for. I forced a smile, nodding as if I understood, as if I accepted it, as if the realization wasn't settling deep into my bones, solidifying into something irreversible, something that I knew I would never be able to come back from. I let my mother introduce me to some distant relatives, let her parade me around like I was just another guest, let her pretend that everything was fine. But as I looked around at the perfectly curated evening, at the expensive gifts piled high next to the cake, at the sheer amount of effort that had gone into making this night special, I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was done pretending. They had made their choice. And soon, I would make mine. I waited until the party was winding down, until the guests had thinned out, until the music had softened to a dull hum in the background, until the only people left were the ones who mattered, at least, the ones who were supposed to matter. My mother was standing by the dessert table, laughing with one of my aunts, a glass of wine in her perfectly manicured hand, while my father was seated near the bar, chatting casually with a few of Tyler's friends, completely at ease, completely unbothered, completely unaware that I had been carrying the weight of their neglect like an anchor around my neck for the last 2 weeks. I had spent the entire evening watching them, listening to them, absorbing every little detail, letting it all settle in, letting it all finally make sense in a way that it never had before. I had spent so much of my life making excuses for them, convincing myself that they didn't mean to make me feel this way, that maybe I was just being too sensitive, that maybe it was my fault for expecting too much, for hoping too much, for wanting something that they were simply incapable of giving. But standing there, watching them celebrate Tyler with effortless joy, watching the way they chose to put in the effort for him while failing to do the bare minimum for me, I realized this wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't just a simple oversight. This was a pattern, a reality, a truth that I had been too afraid to accept for far too long. So I walked toward them with steady steps, weaving through the tables, ignoring the last few lingering guests, ignoring the fake smiles and half-hearted small talk that tried to pull me in. I reached them just as my father took a sip of his drink, just as my mother turned to refill her glass, just as they were both still riding the high of their successful evening, unaware that the moment was about to shift. I cleared my throat, my voice coming out calm, almost casual, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. "Can I talk to you both for a second?" They looked up, mildly surprised, exchanging a glance before nodding, my mother offering me that same polite smile she always gave when she was too busy to really pay attention but wanted to appear engaged. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice steady, my tone neutral, my hands folded in front of me so they wouldn't shake. "I just wanted to ask you something," I said, tilting my head slightly, watching their faces carefully, searching for even the slightest flicker of recognition, of guilt, of anything resembling an acknowledgement of what they had done. "Did either of you realize that you forgot my birthday?" For a second, there was silence, just a brief, fleeting pause where I saw something almost like confusion flicker across my mother's face, while my father simply blinked at me, as if I had just spoken in a language he didn't understand. But then, without hesitation, without even a hint of remorse, my father let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking his head like I had just said something absurd. "Oh, come on, Rachel," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as he leaned back in his chair. "You're an adult. Get over it." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, not because they were unexpected, but because they were so casual, so effortless, so completely devoid of any awareness of how much they hurt. He didn't even think about what he was saying, didn't even consider for a second that maybe, just maybe, his words might cut deeper than he intended. My mother, ever the softer of the two, ever the one who liked to pretend she was the bridge between us, let out a small sigh, shaking her head as she reached for my hand, her touch warm but meaningless, her voice dripping with the kind of understanding that wasn't actually understanding at all. "Oh, honey, it's different for Tyler," she said, giving my fingers a gentle squeeze before letting go. "He's younger, and you know how much he loves birthdays. It's just not the same when you get older, that's all." I stared at them, feeling something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, not even resentment, but something far more dangerous, something final, something that felt like the last remaining thread between us snapping in two. I had come here expecting to be hurt, expecting to feel dismissed, expecting them to downplay it, but what I hadn't expected, what I never could have expected, was that I wouldn't feel anything at all. I nodded slowly, inhaling deeply, letting their words settle over me, letting them sink in a way that they never had before. Then I smiled, small and tight, tilting my head slightly as I let out a quiet breath, my decision already made before I even opened my mouth. "You're right," I said simply, my voice even, my expression unreadable. "I should get over it." My father, satisfied with my supposed agreement, nodded in approval, already turning back toward his drink, already moving on like the conversation had never happened, like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. My mother gave me another quick squeeze of the hand before shifting her attention back to the last few guests, her mind already elsewhere, already forgetting that I had even brought it up. They thought I had dropped it. They thought I had accepted their answer. They thought I had let it go. They couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't make a grand statement, didn't announce my intentions, didn't send a long, emotional message detailing all the reasons why I was done trying, because I knew, without a doubt, that if I did, they would dismiss it just as easily as they had dismissed my feelings before. Instead, I simply let myself fade, let my presence shrink into the background of their lives, let them go on exactly as they always had, without interference, without confrontation, without any dramatic farewell that would give them the opportunity to argue, guilt trip, or convince me that I was overreacting. I didn't stop by for Sunday dinners, didn't send casual text messages about my day, didn't answer when my mother sent the occasional meaningless update about some distant cousin's wedding or my father forwarded yet another article about stock market trends. The first thing I did was remove them from my emergency contacts, a decision that felt strangely liberating, like I was finally undoing a safety net that had never actually been there in the first place. I sat at my desk, scrolling through my phone settings, my fingers hovering for only a moment before I deleted their numbers from the list, replacing them with people who had actually been there for me, friends who had shown up when I needed them, people who had remembered my birthday without a calendar reminder, coworkers who had checked in on me after long weeks without being prompted. I updated my medical forms, changed the beneficiary on my life insurance, quietly ensured that, in the event of an emergency, my parents wouldn't even be notified. Next, I began detangling myself from them financially, which, thankfully, wasn't as complicated as it could have been. There was no joint account to close, no co-signed loans to worry about, no shared property to divide, just a few lingering connections that I had kept out of convenience rather than necessity. I canceled the automatic birthday and holiday gifts I had set up for them years ago, the small but consistent tokens of appreciation that they had never once reciprocated. I unsubscribed from the family group chat, stopped checking my mother's endless Facebook posts about how blessed she was to have such a wonderful son, stopped acknowledging the little scraps of interaction they threw my way whenever it was convenient for them. And the most telling part of it all? They didn't even notice. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, there was nothing, no concerned messages, no questions, no signs that my absence had registered in any meaningful way. They didn't call to ask if I was okay, didn't wonder why I had suddenly stopped responding, didn't check in to see if something had happened, because to them, I had always been secondary, an extra piece of furniture in the background of their lives. A person who existed out of obligation rather than genuine importance. And in a way, I was grateful for that, because it made things easier, made it clearer, made it impossible for me to doubt the decision I had made. Instead of wasting my energy on a family that had never truly valued me, I started pouring it into the people who did. I made time for friends I had neglected while trying to chase after my parents' approval, reached out to coworkers who had always shown me kindness, strengthened the connections that had been waiting for me to choose them instead of clinging to relationships that only drained me. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into small acts of self-care that I had long ignored, and for the first time in my life, I felt free, untethered from the weight of expectation, unburdened by the need to prove myself to people who had never cared enough to see me clearly. I thought about them less and less as the months passed, the bitterness fading into something quieter, something more resolute, something that no longer hurt the way it once had. I had expected the absence to feel like a loss, had anticipated some overwhelming grief that would creep in during the quiet moments, but instead, all I felt was relief. There was no mourning for something that had never truly been there, no emptiness where love had once existed, because the truth was that love had never really been there, not in the way I had needed it, not in the way that mattered. But then, just as I was starting to settle into the peace of my new life, just as I was beginning to believe that they would never reach out, that I would never hear from them again, the phone rang. And I already knew exactly what it meant. They didn't call because they missed me. They didn't call because they realized what they had done. They called because they needed something. Months had passed since I had last spoken to them, months of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, months of learning what it meant to exist without the constant weight of their neglect pressing down on my shoulders. I had expected the silence to feel unnatural, had braced myself for guilt, for regret, for some aching part of me to beg for reconciliation, but none of that ever came. Instead, I found myself waking up lighter, unburdened, untangled from the endless cycle of trying and failing to be noticed, to be appreciated, to be loved in a way that had never truly been possible. I had stopped waiting for them to reach out, had stopped expecting them to suddenly remember I existed, had long accepted that, in their world, I had always been optional. So when my phone began to ring one evening, vibrating persistently against the surface of my kitchen counter, I didn't even glance at the screen, didn't bother checking the caller ID, didn't feel any rush of anticipation or curiosity. I had spent so long removing them from my life that I almost didn't believe they would ever try to push their way back in. But then, the calls didn't stop. First, it was my mother, her name flashing across the screen over and over again, each call going straight to voicemail, her messages left unread, her texts piling up in my inbox with increasing urgency. Then my father joined in, his messages shorter, more direct, lacking the frantic tone of my mother's, but carrying an unmistakable air of expectation, as if he still believed, even after everything, that I would answer simply because he demanded it. I ignored them. For days, I ignored them. And then, when the calls failed, when the texts weren't enough, when they realized I wasn't going to fold as easily as they had expected, they showed up at my door. It was late when I heard the knock, sharp and unrelenting, echoing through my quiet home with a force that made it clear they weren't leaving without answers. I sat on my couch for a long moment, staring at the door, debating whether I should even bother acknowledging their presence, whether I should open myself up to whatever crisis had finally made me worth noticing again. But curiosity won out, a small, bitter part of me needing to see the look on their faces when they realized that I wasn't the same person they had always expected me to be. I opened the door slowly, my expression unreadable, my stance relaxed, my gaze moving from my mother's tear-streaked face to my father's stiff posture, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp with frustration. It was almost laughable, the way they stood there like strangers, the way they suddenly looked so desperate, the way my mother reached for me as if we had spoken just yesterday, as if there wasn't a chasm between us now. A distance that they had spent years creating, but had never truly noticed until this exact moment. Rachel, my mother breathed, her voice trembling, her hands reaching for mine as if she expected me to embrace her, as if she expected me to care. We need to talk, sweetheart, please, it's important. I didn't move, didn't react, didn't step aside to let them in, didn't offer any indication that their presence meant anything to me at all. "Oh," I said simply, my voice calm, my expression unmoved. "That's interesting. You didn't need to talk to me when you forgot my birthday. What changed?" My mother flinched, her lips pressing together, her hands falling back to her sides, her eyes darting toward my father as if searching for help, for guidance, for some way to make this easier. My father exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience visibly thinning, his posture straightening as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Rachel, this isn't the time for petty grudges," he said, his voice low, his tone filled with the same dismissive authority he had always used to shut me down. "Your mother has been trying to reach you for days. We need your help." I leaned against the doorframe, tilting my head slightly, pretending to consider his words, letting the silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. "You need my help?" I echoed, my voice laced with amusement, with something sharp, with something dangerous. "That's funny. I don't remember needing anything from you when I was growing up, but I do remember always being an afterthought. So why exactly should I care now? My mother let out a shaky breath, her fingers twisting anxiously together, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "It's Tyler," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, like she knew the weight of his name would be enough to make me listen, like she still believed that the bond of family meant something to me after all this time. "Something happened, Rachel, and we just need you right now." Of course it was Tyler. Of course it was him. I had spent my entire life standing in his shadow, had spent years watching them pour their love, their attention, their time into him while I was expected to survive on scraps, and now, they wanted me to be there for him? I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head slowly, my fingers tightening around the edge of the door as I studied their faces, as I watched them squirm, as I saw, for the first time in my entire life, the flicker of fear in their eyes, the fear that, maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't be the person they had always expected me to be. "I'm an adult," I said simply, my voice steady, my words an echo of the very ones my father had thrown at me so carelessly before. "Get over it." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and heavy and devastating in its finality, my mother's face crumbling, my father's jaw tightening, the reality of what I had just said sinking into them like a knife to the gut. They had expected me to fold, had expected me to open my door, to let them back in, to be grateful that they had finally acknowledged me after all this time. But they had never once considered that, by the time they finally noticed I was gone, I would already be too far away to reach. My mother was the first to break the silence, her breath shaky, her eyes pleading, her hands wringing together like she was physically trying to hold herself together, like she couldn't comprehend the fact that I wasn't rushing to fix things, wasn't falling into the role I had always played, wasn't giving them exactly what they had always expected from me. Her voice cracked when she spoke, trembling with something that sounded suspiciously like desperation, but I had spent too many years misreading her emotions, mistaking guilt for love, mistaking obligation for care, mistaking her performances for sincerity. "Rachel, sweetheart, please, you're taking this too far," she whispered, stepping toward me like proximity alone would fix the widening gap between us, like if she just reached for me, I would finally come back to them. Finally be the daughter they had always assumed would never leave. "I know we've made mistakes, but we're your family. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" I let her words hang in the air for a moment, let them settle between us, let her really hear them before I finally tilted my head slightly, watching her carefully, watching the way her lips trembled, the way her fingers twitched as if she was resisting the urge to reach for me again. I should have felt something in that moment, some flicker of doubt, some small pang of sympathy, some distant urge to offer them something, but all I felt was an unshakable sense of certainty, a clarity I had never known before. A realization that had taken me far too long to come to. "Family is supposed to be everything," I said, my voice even, steady, completely unshaken by the moment unfolding before me, because I had already made peace with my decision long before they ever showed up at my door. "But family is also supposed to be a two-way street." I let my eyes flick between them, watching as my father's expression hardened, as my mother's face twisted into something that looked suspiciously like shame, as the weight of my words settled over them like a storm cloud ready to break. My father scoffed then, shaking his head like this entire conversation was beneath him, like he still couldn't believe that I was actually serious, like he still expected me to cave if he just pushed hard enough. "Oh, come on, Rachel. Don't be dramatic," he said, his tone clipped, his patience wearing thin, his desperation hidden beneath a thin layer of irritation. "You're holding on to something that isn't that big of a deal. We're still your parents, and no matter how much you try to shut us out, that's never going to change." I inhaled slowly, nodding to myself, letting his words roll off of me like water, unaffected by the sheer audacity of his belief that biology alone entitled him to a relationship with me, that blood alone was enough to erase a lifetime of neglect. I exhaled, shifting my weight slightly, my fingers tapping idly against the doorframe as I studied them both, as I felt the final piece of my plan falling perfectly into place. That's true, I admitted, my tone deceptively light, my expression unreadable. You'll always be my parents. But that doesn't mean you get to be in my life. My mother let out a sharp inhale, her body visibly stiffening, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, as if she was already preparing another excuse, another plea, another way to turn this back around. My father, however, just stared at me, his face unreadable, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if he had finally realized that he wasn't going to win this argument, as if he had finally understood that I was done playing this game. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling briefly before turning the screen toward them, letting them see the list of names I had already erased, the contacts I had already deleted, the final step in cutting them out completely. Their names were gone. Their numbers were erased. Every financial tie, every emergency contact, every last thread that connected us had been severed. I already made my decision, I said, my voice quieter now, but no less certain. You didn't lose me tonight. You lost me the moment I realized that I was only visible to you when you needed something from me. I watched the way my mother's shoulders slumped, the way my father's nostrils flared, the way understanding finally dawned in their eyes, not just the realization of what I was saying, but the full weight of it, the irreversible nature of my choice, the undeniable fact that they had pushed me too far for too long, and now, for the first time, they had no way of pulling me back. My mother tried again, her voice cracking under the pressure, her hands reaching for me one last time, as if this time, I would finally give in. Rachel, please, you don't mean that, she whispered, her fingers trembling, her desperation raw and thick and too late. You don't have to do this. We're family. I smiled then, small and tight and utterly indifferent to her words, because I had already made peace with the truth that had been staring me in the face my entire life, the truth that I had spent years refusing to acknowledge. You only noticed I was gone when you needed me, I said softly, my voice carrying through the still night air like the final nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we had left. And that tells me everything. I didn't wait for their response, didn't wait for my mother to break down into tears, didn't wait for my father to find some last-ditch effort to reel me back in. Instead, I turned, stepping back inside my home, my sanctuary, my life that no longer had room for them, and without another word, I closed the door in their faces. I didn't look back. I didn't second-guess myself. I didn't regret a single thing. And for the first time in my life, I was finally free.